I watched my parents build a golden throne for my thieving brother, while I paid for every mistake I ever made. Then I found the screenshots that proved he robbed our dying grandmother blind. The papers were still warm from the printer when I set them on my mother's dining table. $50,000 wired into Ethan's checking account on March 4th. $50,000 gone to Bet King Casino 3 hours and 11 minutes later. I lined the two screenshots up side by side, corner to corner, so nobody could pretend the numbers were a coincidence. Here's $50,000 into Ethan's account, I said. My hands were shaking so hard the papers rattled against the wood. Here's that same $50,000 hitting a casino 3 hours later. Nobody spoke. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My father set down his coffee cup without looking at it, missed the coaster, and didn't notice the ring it left. Then the room exploded all at once like someone had lit a fuse under every chair. Ethan lunged across the table for the papers. He was too slow. Aunt Diane had already grabbed one, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she scanned the numbers twice, then a third time, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. Ethan's face went the color of drywall. My mother rounded on me before she'd read a single line, jabbing a finger in my direction, telling me I had no right to ambush the family like this at Sunday dinner. Uncle Gerald, who had been quiet the whole meal, pushed his chair back slow and deliberate, the legs scraping against the hardwood like a warning shot, and walked around the table until he was standing over my brother. "Explain to me," he said in the flat, even voice he probably used on suspects for 22 years on the force, "how you steal from your dying grandmother." Ethan's mouth worked for a second before anything came out. "It wasn't stealing," he said. I had a strategy. I was going to pay it back. It was an investment." Uncle Gerald didn't blink. "An investment in what? Slot machines?" That was when my mother shoved him. Actually shoved him, both hands flat against her own brother's chest, screaming that this was her house and her son and nobody got to talk to him that way at her table. My father was up a half second later, shoving Gerald from the other side, and for one surreal moment, I watched 3 grown adults grapple around a dining table while a bowl of green beans went over and rolled across the floor. Aunt Diane had backed into the corner by the fireplace, sobbing into both hands. Ethan used the chaos to bolt for the front door, and Uncle Gerald, even off balance, even with my mother's hands still fisted in his shirt, got there first and blocked it with his whole body. Ethan went down to his knees right there in the front hall, sobbing into the tile. "I have a disease," he said. "I was so close to a big win. I was going to fix everything. How could my own sister do this to me?" That was the moment it flipped. I watched it happen in real time, like watching a switch get thrown. My mother let go of Gerald's shirt and crossed the room and got down on the floor with Ethan, cradling his head against her shoulder the way you'd hold a toddler who skinned his knee. My father announced to the room in his courtroom voice that his son needed treatment, not judgment, and that anyone who couldn't see that could leave. I asked one question, just one. Did anyone in that room remember Grandma Vivien, 82 years old, sitting in a house with the thermostat locked at 60 degrees because she said she couldn't afford to run the furnace, eating stale bread because a full loaf lasted her longer, while Ethan lost $200,000 of her savings on a screen that lit up red and gold every time it took another $20 from her? My mother told me I was heartless for even asking. Uncle Gerald pulled out his phone and called a detective anyway. I need to back up though, because none of that makes sense without 20 years of context first. You need to understand what our house was actually like before you'll understand why nobody in that room except maybe Gerald and me was surprised that Ethan could do something like this, and why almost everyone in that room was still willing to forgive him for it before the sentence was even finished. I'm Rachel. I was 32 years old the night that dinner happened, and Ethan is my older brother, 35 at the time, 3 years ahead of me in everything our parents ever measured. We grew up in a 4-bedroom colonial on Larchmont Drive in Springboro, Ohio, the kind of house with a 2-car garage and a mailbox shaped like a barn that our father repainted every spring. My father, Robert, sold commercial insurance for 31 years at the same agency downtown. My mother, Linda, stayed home until I was in middle school, then went back to work part-time at a dentist's office reception desk, mostly I think, so she'd have somewhere to go that wasn't our house. From the time I could understand a report card, the rules were different for the two of us, and not in a way anybody in that family would admit to out loud. I got a B+ in 10th grade chemistry, 1 B+ out of 6 classes with everything else in A, and my father took my car keys for 3 weeks and made me write out the periodic table from memory every night until I could do it without looking. Ethan failed 2 classes his junior year. My mother called it a rough patch and hired him a $400 a month tutor she paid for out of the grocery budget, and nobody took away so much as his phone charger. When I was 17, I scraped the side mirror of my mother's minivan against the garage door frame, backing out too fast one morning before a shift at the movie theater. I paid for the repair myself, $240 out of a paycheck that came to about $9 an hour, $4 over minimum wage at the time, ushering people to their seats and sweeping up popcorn after Friday night showings. My father drove me to the body shop and stood there while I handed over the cash in an envelope, and on the way home he told me this was a good lesson in responsibility. I remember being proud of myself. I didn't understand yet that the lesson only applied to me. Ethan got his license at 16 and totaled his first car, a hand-me-down Civic that had been mine before it was his, into a mailbox 2 blocks from our house, drunk, at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after he turned 17. My father picked him up from the police station confrontation himself, and I remember lying awake listening to the garage door open at 1 in the morning, listening to my parents' voices low and urgent in the kitchen below my room. 3 weeks later, there was a brand new red Ford truck in the driveway with a bow made out of duct-taped ribbon on the hood, because my father said Ethan needed something safer. Nobody used the word DUI in front of me again. I only found out years later from Uncle Gerald that my father had called in a favor with a friend on the force to keep it off Ethan's record entirely. There was another incident, smaller, that I think about more than almost anything else from those years, because it was the first time I understood the rules weren't just unfair, they were bottomless. When I was 19, home from community college for the summer, I noticed $60 missing from the envelope of cash I kept in my sock drawer. Tip money from a hostessing job. I didn't accuse anyone, I just mentioned it at dinner, lightly, asking if anyone had seen it. My mother's face changed for half a second, a flicker, there and gone, before she asked me if I was sure I hadn't just miscounted. I let it go because I didn't have proof and because pushing it felt like more trouble than $60 was worth. 4 years later, moving boxes out of Ethan's old bedroom closet after he'd finally gotten his own apartment, I found a shoebox of ticket stubs and receipts from that same summer, a concert, a jacket, a tank of gas, dated the same week my $60 disappeared. I never said anything. By then, it felt like ancient history. One small theft buried under so many bigger ones that pointing at it would have seemed almost comical. But it taught me something that mattered later. Ethan had been taking things that weren't his since he was a teenager. Quietly, opportunistically, from people who loved him too much to ask hard questions. Grandma Vivien wasn't an aberration. She was just the largest sock drawer he ever found. That was the pattern for the rest of our childhood, all the way through college. Ethan cheated on 3 separate exams in high school. I know because I saw the cheat sheet fall out of his binder once in the car, a strip of paper with chemistry formulas written in his handwriting so small it looked like a barcode. And each time my father called the school directly, called the principal by his first name, talked about unfair targeting and due process, until the suspensions got reduced to warnings, until the warnings got reduced to nothing at all. I brought home a 94 on a physics test my senior year, 1 point under the threshold for extra credit, and my father asked me at dinner what happened. I'm not telling you this to complain about my childhood. I'm telling you this because you need to understand the machinery that was already built and running long before Grandma Vivien ever got sick. My parents had spent 2 decades constructing an excuse generator specifically calibrated to my brother, and by the time it mattered, by the time actual money, actual stakes, and actual vulnerable 82-year-old woman were on the line, that machine was running so smoothly none of them even noticed it turn on. It didn't feel like a decision to them. It felt like breathing. Grandma Vivien was my mother's mother. She'd been a widow since I was 11, living alone in a small ranch house on Redbird Lane about 15 minutes from us, the same house she and my grandfather had bought in 1974. She'd worked as a school librarian for 30 years and never made much money, but my grandfather had been careful with what they saved, and between his life insurance payout and a modest inheritance from her own mother, by the time she turned 80, she had just over $210,000 sitting in savings and CDs at a regional bank. She used to tell us at every holiday that the money wasn't hers, it was ours, mine, Ethan's, and our cousin Priya's, split 3 ways someday. She said it so many times it became a kind of family joke. Grandma tapping the arm of her recliner and saying, "That's your college money, that's your house money, don't you kids go spending it before I'm even in the ground." In October of 2022, Grandma Vivien was diagnosed with early vascular dementia by her neurologist, Dr. Amati, at a clinic in Dayton. It wasn't advanced. She still knew all our names, still remembered her wedding anniversary down to the restaurant they ate at, but there were gaps. She'd repeat the same story 3 times in an hour. She got lost once driving to the pharmacy she'd used for 20 years, and a police officer found her parked on the shoulder of Route 73, crying, unable to remember which direction was home. My mother cried when she told us. She said it felt like losing her mother in slow motion. Ethan started visiting Grandma Vivien almost every day after that diagnosis. At first I thought it was sweet. I really did. He'd bring her groceries, sit with her while she watched her shows, help her sort through medication. My mother started calling him such a good boy, in a way she never had before, not even when he made the honor roll his 1 good semester of college. In January of 2023, Ethan asked Grandma Vivien to sign paperwork, giving him power of attorney over her finances. He told the family it was just in case, that someone needed to be able to pay her bills if her memory got worse, that he was doing it because he loved her and nobody else had stepped up. My parents were thrilled. My father actually said at a family dinner that it was good to see Ethan finally growing up and taking responsibility. I remember sitting there thinking about the garage door mirror, about the $240 out of my movie theater paycheck, and saying nothing. Something felt wrong to me almost immediately, though I couldn't have told you exactly what. Grandma Vivien started wearing the same 3 sweaters in rotation. She mentioned once, almost in passing, that she'd asked Ethan for money to fix her water heater, and he'd told her it wasn't a good time. I asked my mother about it, and she waved me off, said Ethan was being smart, that he was managing Grandma's money carefully so it would last. I brought it up again at Easter that year, and my father told me, in front of the whole table, that I'd always had a chip on my shoulder about Ethan, and maybe it was time I let it go. Nobody asked to see a single bank statement. Nobody asked what managing carefully actually meant. I let it drop because I was tired of being the only person in that family who ever asked asked questions, and because some small, ugly part of me still wanted to believe my father was right about me. Grandma Vivien died in August of 2023, 4 days after her 83rd birthday, in her sleep, at the same house on Redbird Lane she'd lived in for almost 50 years. The will was read 3 weeks later, at a lawyer's office in Springboro, in a small conference room with a fake ficus plant in the corner, and a box of tissues placed in the exact center of the table like someone had planned for this moment specifically. The estate attorney, an older man who'd handled Grandma's affairs for over a decade, read through the bequests in a flat, practiced voice, the china cabinet to Aunt Diane, the wedding ring to my mother, small keepsakes to various grandchildren, and then reached the section about the cash accounts, and paused, just slightly, before reading the number out loud. $10,200. Split 3 ways between me, Ethan, and Priya, out of $210,000 that had existed less than a year earlier. I remember the attorney glancing up over his glasses, just for a second, like even he found the number strange enough to want to gauge the room's reaction. My mother didn't blink. She was already reaching over to squeeze Ethan's hand. Ethan had an answer ready before anyone even asked the question. Medical bills, he said. Home health aides. A hospital stay in the spring that insurance hadn't fully covered. He said it fast and smooth, like he'd rehearsed it. And when my mother asked gently if he had any of the receipts, he said he'd get them together, that everything was still in boxes from clearing out the house. 3 weeks became 3 months. My father told anyone who asked that the boy's grieving, give him time. Nobody in that family, not my mother, not my father, not Aunt Diane, not any of Grandma's siblings who came to the funeral, ever once demanded to see a bank statement. $200,000 had evaporated from an 82-year-old woman's life savings, and the only investigation anyone conducted was my father asking Ethan once, gently, over beers, if he was doing okay. My cousin Priya pulled me aside at a cousin's baby shower in October in the kitchen, away from everyone, and asked if I had a minute. Priya worked as an assistant branch manager at First Merit Bank in Dayton, had for 6 years, and she had a look on her face I'd never seen on her before, somewhere between sick and furious. I wasn't going to say anything, she told me, her voice pitched low even though we were alone. It's not really my business, and I could actually lose my job for even looking at this. But Rachel, I can't not tell you. She'd pulled Ethan's account activity, not through her own branch, she was careful to clarify, through a colleague at the bank where Ethan actually banked, someone she'd gone to college with who owed her a favor and didn't fully understand what she was asking for until it was too late to take it back. She showed me on her phone, screenshot after screenshot, $50,000 wired in on March 4th, gone within 3 hours to a merchant coded as Bet King Casino and Resort, $30,000 more on April 19th, same pattern, gone by that evening, $40,000 on May 30th, wire in, gone within hours, every single time, like clockwork. She had 11 months of it, dates lined up next to dollar amounts lined up next to timestamps, more damning than anything I could have imagined on my own. He didn't spend it on her care, Priya said. He spent it on slots. Grandma froze in that house with the heat turned down to save money, and he was betting 50 grand at a time 3 miles away. I sat on the bathroom floor of my cousin's house for 20 minutes after that conversation, screenshots saved to my own phone, trying to figure out what to do with information that could blow apart my entire family. Part of me wanted to burn the photos and pretend I'd never seen them. I knew exactly how this would go. I knew my parents would somehow find a way to make this my fault before the conversation was over. But I kept thinking about Grandma Vivien in that cold house, eating stale bread, trusting the grandson she'd practically raised, and I couldn't put the phone down. I spent 2 weeks gathering everything I could without tipping Ethan off. I called the casino directly, using Grandma's date of death and a story about settling an estate, and got a customer service rep to confirm, carelessly, more than she should have, that an account under Ethan's name had significant activity over the prior year. I found out, almost by accident following a thread through Aunt Diane at Thanksgiving, that Ethan had been asking other relatives for money too, small loans here and there that never got paid back, going back years further than any of us realized. I started keeping a folder, dates, screenshots, timestamps, a printed bank statement Priya was eventually brave enough to hand me directly, her hands shaking as she passed it across a coffee shop table, telling me this was the last thing she could do, that after this, it was on me. Each new piece I found raised the ceiling of what I thought was possible, and each time, Ethan somehow found a way to climb over it. First, I thought it was one bad withdrawal, maybe a misunderstanding, maybe a home repair he'd been embarrassed to explain. Then I found the second transfer, and the third, and I told myself it still might be medical, still might be legitimate, because the alternative was too large to hold. Then I found the pattern of timing, every transfer landing in Ethan's account on a weekday afternoon, every corresponding casino charge posting within hours, never on a Sunday, never on a day Grandma had a doctor's appointment scheduled, which ruled out even the thin excuse that these were emergency withdrawals for care. Then Priya told me about the dementia diagnosis predating the power of attorney by 4 months, and the ceiling I thought I'd finally hit turned out to have another floor above it entirely. I remember calling Daniel from my car outside Priya's apartment, both hands still shaking, saying the same sentence over and over. He knew. He had to have known. Nobody accidentally times 11 withdrawals to a dementia patient's good afternoons for 11 months straight. I called Grandma's old bank branch directly, the one on Redbird Lane she'd used for decades, and spoke with a teller teller who remembered her fondly, who told me, unprompted, that Ethan had come in twice asking the tellers to raise Grandma's daily wire transfer limit, each time with Grandma present but largely silent, nodding along to whatever he said. The teller mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd found it a little strange at the time, that Grandma usually chatted with her about her garden, and on those 2 visits, she'd just sat quietly in the chair by the door, looking at her hands. I didn't tell the teller why I was asking. I thanked her and hung up and sat with that image for a long time. Grandma Vivien, once sharp enough to run a school library single-handedly for 3 decades, sitting silent in a plastic chair while her grandson negotiated away the last of her independence, one signature at a time. By the time I called the family meeting for that Sunday in November, I had 41 pages. I only needed 2. You already know what happened at that dinner. What you don't know is what happened after Uncle Gerald made that phone call. Standing in the front hallway with his back against the door, my brother sobbing on the tile in front of him, Detective Karen Ross showed up at my parents' house that same night, just past 9, in an unmarked sedan with the Warren County Sheriff's Office insignia on the door. My father met her on the porch and demanded to see a warrant before he'd let her pass the threshold. She told him calmly, without raising her voice, that this was a voluntary conversation, that she was happy to take statements at the station instead if that was more comfortable, and that either way she'd be talking to everyone in that house before the night was over. My father stood there for a long moment, jaw working, then stepped aside. Priya arrived 20 minutes later with her laptop and a manila folder of printouts, and for the next 2 hours, Detective Ross sat at my parents' kitchen table, taking notes while Priya walked through every transfer. 50,000 here, 30,000 there, 40,000 after that. 11 transactions in total, adding up to just over $190,000, every single one of them following Grandma Vivien's money from her account through Ethan's power of attorney authority into a casino 2 exits down the highway. Detective Ross photographed every page. She asked precise, unhurried questions, dates, account numbers, who had access, who had signed what. Ethan, when it was his turn, sat across from her with his arms crossed and told her Grandma had verbally approved every withdrawal. He said she trusted him completely, that she'd told him more than once to use it however you think is best, that there was no paperwork because paperwork felt insulting to what they had. Detective Ross asked if he had any documentation of that verbal consent, texts, emails, a witness. He didn't. That was when I mentioned the neurologist's report. Dr. Amati had documented Grandma's vascular dementia diagnosis in October of 2022, 4 months before Ethan asked her to sign power of attorney, and the notes, which I'd requested a copy of weeks earlier, using my status as next of kin, before anyone thought to stop me, specifically flagged concerns about her capacity for complex financial decision-making going forward. Detective Ross wrote that down word for word and asked me to email her a copy before I left. Ethan called a criminal defense attorney before he went to bed that night. The following week, the picture got worse, not better. Aunt Diane called me, hesitant, almost apologetic, to say she'd never mentioned it before because it felt petty next to everything else. But Ethan had borrowed $1,200 from her back in 2019 for a security deposit and never paid a cent of it back. Once she said it out loud, it was like a dam broke. Uncle Gerald's adult son had lent Ethan $500 for car repairs 2 years earlier. A second cousin, someone I barely knew, had wired him $300 after a story about a medical bill that turned out, on closer inspection, to line up suspiciously well with a losing streak at Bet King that same week. All told, once everyone started comparing notes in a group text that Priya started and that I still have saved, we found 8 separate relatives who'd handed Ethan money over the years, $30,000 combined. None of it ever repaid. Every request wrapped in a different sob story, urgent enough to feel rude to refuse, small enough that nobody had ever compared notes before. This wasn't one bad year. This was a decade-long pattern that our family had simply never assembled into a single picture, because Ethan had been careful, deliberately, methodically careful, to never ask the same person twice in a row, to never let 2 relatives compare stories at the same holiday, to always frame the story with just enough specificity to sound real, and just enough urgency to discourage questions. My parents' response to all of this was to close ranks. 2 days after the detective's visit, my mother sent a mass email to something like 30 people, aunts, uncles, cousins, even a few of my parents' longtime friends who barely knew Ethan, accusing certain family members of orchestrating a witch hunt against a son who was sick and needed compassion, not persecution. She never used my name, but she didn't have to. I got 4 separate texts from relatives asking if I was okay, if this was really happening, if my mother had actually written what they thought she'd written. Meanwhile, quietly, through a joint checking account I only found out about because Priya kept her ear to the ground at the bank, my parents wired $8,000 to a criminal defense attorney's retainer account on Ethan's behalf within 10 days of that dinner. These were the same parents who, 3 years earlier, told me they simply didn't have an extra $1,000 to help me pay for a professional certification course I needed for a promotion at work. $1,000 I ended up putting on a credit card and paying off myself in installments over 14 months, while listening to my father tell me it was good for me to learn to budget. I hired my own attorney the following week. His name was Mr. Bennett, an older man with a downtown office that smelled like old carpet and coffee, who specialized in elder financial abuse and probate litigation. I told him everything. everything. The power of attorney, the transfers, the casino, the dementia diagnosis, the will. He listened without interrupting, took the folder from me, and by the end of the meeting told me we had, in his words, about as clean a case as I've seen in 20 years of doing this. We filed a civil lawsuit against Ethan in December, seeking $230,000, the full amount unaccounted for, plus interest, plus legal fees, on behalf of Grandma Vivien's estate, which by extension meant on behalf of me, Ethan, and Priya as the named beneficiaries. Filing a lawsuit against your own brother is not something you do lightly, and I want to be honest that I threw up in the parking garage after signing the paperwork. But I kept thinking about that cold house. I kept thinking about the stale bread. My mother called me every single day for 2 weeks straight, sometimes crying, sometimes furious, always circling back to the same plea. Drop it, let the family heal. Ethan was getting help now. Did I really want to be the reason he went to prison? One night, she called at 11:30, her voice thick with wine, and told me that I had always been jealous of Ethan, that this whole lawsuit was really about a B+ from 15 years ago, that I'd apparently never gotten over. I let her finish. Then I asked her calmly whether she remembered the water heater Grandma couldn't afford to fix, the one Ethan told her wasn't a good time for, while he was sitting in a high-limit slots lounge 3 miles away. She didn't have an answer for that. She just told me I was cruel and hung up. My father called exactly once, and he didn't ask me to drop the suit. He told me that if I went forward with it, I shouldn't bother coming to Christmas, and that as far as he was concerned, I'd be making my choice about which family I wanted to belong to. I sat in my car outside my office for 40 minutes after that call before I could make myself go back inside. I remember thinking, with a kind of clarity that almost felt peaceful, that my father had just said out loud the thing our whole childhood had been teaching me quietly for 20 years, that loving Ethan and loving the truth were, in that house, mutually exclusive, and I was finally being asked to pick one for good. I didn't drop it. Discovery started in February. Mr. Bennett's paralegal spent 6 weeks pulling every financial record connected to Grandma Vivien's estate and to Ethan's accounts under subpoena, a process slower and more grinding than anything I'd expected. Bank after bank, statement after statement, cross-referenced against casino loyalty records that Bet King Casino fought releasing for almost a month before a judge ordered them to comply. I sat in Mr. Bennett's office on a Thursday afternoon in March, going through the most recent batch of records with him page by page, when he stopped on one particular wire transfer and turned the paper around so I could see it properly. $40,000 sent from an account we hadn't previously traced, a secondary account Ethan had opened under a slightly different configuration of his name, Ethan R. Whitfield instead of Ethan Robert Whitfield, that had briefly slipped past the initial subpoena, routed out on a date in June of the previous year, 3 weeks before Grandma Vivien died. It hadn't gone to Bet King Casino. It had gone to a woman named Kayla Voss. I didn't recognize the name. Neither did Mr. Bennett until his paralegal cross-referenced it against employment records pulled as part of the casino subpoena and found that Kayla Voss worked at Bet King Casino and Resort as a VIP player host, the employee assigned to court and retain the casino's highest-spending regular customers, the person who comps their rooms, calls them personally when they haven't visited in a while, and, as it turned out, had been doing considerably more than that for my brother. The papers sat fanned out under the desk lamp in Mr. Bennett's office, and the moment I read her name typed at the top of that wire transfer, my stomach dropped straight through the floor, because I had heard that name before, not from Ethan, from my mother, in passing, months earlier, complaining that Ethan had a girlfriend she'd never even met, someone he'd mentioned once and then never brought up again, someone my mother assumed hadn't worked out because Ethan stopped talking about her. My mother had chalked it up to Ethan being private about his personal life during a hard year. Nobody had ever asked her name. Nobody had ever asked what she did for a living. I understood, sitting in that office, that this wasn't over. It wasn't even close to over. Priya paid a price for all of this too, one I don't think I fully appreciated until much later. The colleague who'd first pulled Ethan's account activity for her got investigated internally, after the bank noticed unusual access logs during the discovery process, and though he kept his job, he stopped speaking to Priya entirely, blaming her for putting him at risk over what he called someone else's family drama. Priya herself was called in by her branch manager for a formal conversation about data privacy policy, and though nothing went on her record, she told me once quietly, over coffee, that she thought about that meeting every single day, replaying whether she'd made the right call. I asked her if she regretted it. She said no, not even for a second, but that regret and cost weren't the same thing, and she'd paid a cost nobody else in the family would ever fully see or thank her for. I think about that a lot. Priya didn't inherit anything from Grandma Vivien worth protecting for herself. She did it because it was right, and she absorbed almost all of the risk for the rest of us. Mr. Bennett's investigator tracked down Kayla Voss within a week, and what came out over the following month reframed the entire case in a way none of us had been prepared for. Kayla was 31, had worked at Bet King Casino for 6 years, and had met Ethan at the high-limit slots room during one of his very first visits, back in early 2023, not long after he'd secured power of attorney over Grandma Vivien's accounts. She'd been assigned to him as his personal host almost immediately. Casinos identify big spenders fast, and Ethan, dropping tens of thousands of dollars in single sittings, had gotten flagged within his first month as exactly the kind of customer worth cultivating a relationship with. with, comped hotel suites, free dinners at the steakhouse, personal phone calls checking in when he hadn't visited in a few days, gently encouraging him to come back, that they missed him, that the tables were lucky lately. They started a romantic relationship within a few months, one Ethan kept entirely hidden from our family. Kayla, according to her own deposition, insisted she never knew where his money was coming from, that Ethan told her he'd inherited a small business from a business partner, that his gambling was recreational and well within his means. But the $40,000 transfer told a different story. It had gone toward a down payment on a townhouse in her name, one Ethan had never lived in but had visited regularly, according to neighbors his investigator interviewed. She'd also received, over the prior year, close to $11,000 in smaller transfers, jewelry, a leased car, a vacation to Cancun, that Tud posted about on social media with captions thanking her sweet man for spoiling her. When Mr. Bennett's team deposed her, she swore, hand raised, that she'd had no idea the money might be connected to an elderly relative's care fund. It was hard to know how much of that to believe. What was undeniable, whatever she knew or didn't, was that she had spent thousands of it on the car, on furniture for the townhouse, on that trip to Cancun, long before anyone in my family had said a word about any of this, long before Grandma Vivien was even 6 months in the ground. I sat with that fact for a long time. My brother hadn't just gambled our grandmother's life savings away out of some uncontrollable compulsion, the disease he'd sobbed about on the hallway tile. Some of it, not all of it. The casino records left no doubt the addiction itself was real and enormous, but some meaningful piece of that $200,000 had gone toward building a secret second life with a woman he met specifically because he was already spending Grandma's money, a relationship the casino itself had engineered as part of retaining a whale of a customer. He'd been getting robbed and doing the robbing at the same time, and somehow, through it all, he'd kept smiling at Sunday dinners like nothing in the world was wrong. We amended the lawsuit in April to add Kayla Voss as a co-defendant, seeking recovery of the funds transferred to her directly and separately. Mr. Bennett filed a formal complaint with the Ohio Casino Control Commission regarding BetKing's host program and its role in what our filing described as predatory retention practices targeting a customer the casino's own systems should have flagged for unusual financial vulnerability. Whether that complaint would go anywhere, Mr. Bennett couldn't promise, but it existed now, on paper, in the state's records. My family did not take the new revelation well, though not in the direction I expected. I thought, foolishly, I see now, that finding out about Kayla might finally break through to my parents, might make them see the full shape of what their son had done, instead of the sanitized, sympathetic version he'd been feeding them. Instead, my mother found a new frame almost instantly. Ethan wasn't a thief. He was a victim, seduced and manipulated by a predatory casino employee who'd targeted him specifically because of his vulnerability. My father started referring to Kayla, in family conversations, as that woman, as though she alone had orchestrated the entire 11-month pattern of wire transfers that required Ethan's signature, Ethan's power of attorney, and Ethan's own hand at every slot machine. It was Aunt Diane, of all people, who finally cracked. She'd been quiet through most of the earlier fallout, caught between loyalty to my mother, her sister, and her own slow-dawning horror at what had actually happened. But hearing my mother recast Ethan as a victim of Kayla Voss, after everything, after the frozen house, after the stale bread, after watching her own mother's inheritance evaporate into a stranger's townhouse down payment, was apparently the final straw. She stood up at a family gathering in May, one I wasn't even present for but heard about within the hour from 3 different people, and told my mother, in front of everyone, that she was done making excuses, that Linda had spent 35 years teaching her son that consequences were something that happened to other people, and that this, all of this, was the bill finally coming due. My mother didn't speak to Aunt Diane for 2 months after that. The family split cleanly down a line I hadn't fully anticipated. Uncle Gerald obviously was firmly on the side of accountability. He'd been the one to call the detective in the first place, and he showed up to 2 separate depositions just to sit in the gallery, arms crossed, saying nothing, making his position unmistakable through presence alone. Priya, having risked her own job to hand me those first screenshots, never wavered, though she told me privately it cost her a friendship with Ethan's college roommate, someone she'd known since she was a teenager, who accused her of destroying a family over money. Aunt Diane came around fully after her outburst in May, and brought 2 of her adult children with her. My parents, though, along with a small cluster of my father's siblings who barely knew the details and simply sided with blood over evidence, dug in harder the longer the case dragged on. My father stopped calling me entirely. My mother's calls became less frequent but more desperate, oscillating between pleading and cold fury, sometimes within the same conversation. At one point, she told me that if Ethan went to prison, it would be my fault, specifically mine, as though Detective Ross and the Warren County Prosecutor's Office and a BetKing casino paper trail spanning 11 months had all been incidental details next to my decision to bring the folder to that Sunday dinner in the first place. There were unexpected allies, too, people I hadn't expected to hear from at all. A second cousin named Marcus, someone I'd maybe spoken to 5 times in my whole life, reached out to say he'd also lent Ethan money years earlier and never gotten it back, and that he wanted to add his own account to whatever record we were building, even though the amount, $400 from 2018, was too old and too small to matter legally. He said he just wanted it written down somewhere that it happened. A formal former co-worker of Grandma Vivien's from the school library, a woman named Ruth, who was 86 herself and had visited Grandma weekly right up until the end, contacted Mr. Bennett's office directly after hearing about the case through the neighborhood, offering to testify to what she'd personally witnessed, the cold house, Grandma's worry about money that never used to worry her, a comment Grandma had made to Ruth just weeks before she died, confused and frightened, about how she didn't understand where all her money had gone. Even one of Ethan's own old friends came forward, a man named Josh who'd known him since middle school and had drifted out of his life around the time the gambling started in earnest. Josh called me directly, having gotten my number from Priya through a mutual friend, and told me, awkwardly, apologetically, that he'd suspected something was wrong with Ethan's finances for years, but had never said anything because it wasn't his place, and that watching the family's private business spill into a group chat had finally shamed him into admitting he'd seen Ethan lose $4,000 in a single night at Bet King back in 2021, long before Grandma Vivien ever got sick, and that Ethan had laughed it off afterward like it was nothing. It confirmed something I'd already suspected, but hadn't been able to prove. The addiction predated the theft by years. Grandma's money hadn't created the problem. It had just finally been large enough and accessible enough to reveal how big the problem already was. Even Bet King Casino, in a strange and unplanned way, ended up handing us more evidence than they intended. As part of complying with the discovery subpoena, they were required to turn over Ethan's full player tracking history, the internal system casinos use to log every card swipe, every session length, every dollar wagered and lost. Mr. Bennett's paralegal built a single spreadsheet out of 3 years of that data, and seeing it laid out in rows and columns did something none of the earlier screenshots had managed. It made the scale of it undeniable even to someone determined not to see it. 211 separate visits, an average session length just under 4 hours, total lifetime losses, going back to a period well before any of Grandma's money was involved, of over $300,000, most of it money Ethan had never disclosed to anyone, borrowed and borrowed again, in a cycle that had clearly been running for the better part of a decade, with Grandma Vivien's savings as merely its largest and most catastrophic fuel source. That testimony broke something in me the first time Mr. Bennett read it aloud from Ruth's written statement. I had to leave his office and sit in my car in the parking lot for a while before I could drive home. Somewhere in the middle of lawsuits and depositions and screenshots, I think I'd let the actual human cost of it get abstract, turned into exhibits and dollar figures. Ruth's statement made it real again. Grandma Vivien, alone in that house, cold, confused, wondering out loud to a friend where her whole life savings had gone, while the grandson she trusted most sat 3 miles away at a blackjack table. I started seeing a therapist that same month, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who specialized in family estrangement, and the first thing she asked me in our very first session was whether I felt guilty. I said no, automatically, and she just waited, the way good therapists do, until I admitted that of course I did. Not guilty for exposing Ethan, but guilty for every year before that when I'd noticed something was wrong and let my father talk me out of trusting myself. She helped me understand that the chip on my shoulder my father always accused me of having was actually just a working set of eyes, that I had spent 2 decades being told not to believe what I could plainly see, and that the real damage of a house like ours wasn't only the unequal punishments. It was training a child to distrust her own judgment so thoroughly that she'd hesitate to report actual theft from an actual dying woman for fear of being called dramatic one more time. I still see Dr. Okafor every other week. It's the best money I've ever spent, and unlike almost everything else in this story, nobody has ever made me feel bad about spending it. Ethan's deposition, when it finally happened in May, was the only time I saw him in person during the entire year of litigation, across a conference table with our respective attorneys on either side. He looked smaller than I remembered, thinner. The tan he used to keep up religiously faded to nothing. He answered most of Mr. Rao Bennett's questions with variations of "I don't recall," or "that would have been for her care," even when the documents in front of him said otherwise in black and white. At one point, Mr. Bennett asked him directly whether he'd ever told our grandmother the true balance of her accounts in the 6 months before her death. There was a long pause. The court reporter's fingers stopped moving. Ethan finally said quietly that he'd told her the accounts were doing fine. I watched his jaw tighten and then release, and for just a moment, before the practiced blankness came back over his face, I thought I saw something that might have been shame. It didn't last. By the next question, he was back to, "I don't recall." Ethan, meanwhile, made a series of increasingly desperate moves as the case tightened around him. In June, his criminal defense attorney, the one my parents were quietly funding, attempted to argue that Grandma Vivien's dementia diagnosis, the very thing that proved she lacked capacity to meaningfully consent to the withdrawals, actually cut the other way, that her occasional confusion meant she might have authorized transfers she later forgot, and that the prosecution couldn't prove a negative. Detective Ross, when this theory reached her, reportedly laughed out loud in a meeting with the prosecutor, according to Priya's contact at the courthouse, who overheard secondhand. The theory did not survive contact with Dr. Ahmadi's actual medical records, which documented Grandma's specific and worsening incapacity for complex financial reasoning, starting a full 4 months before the power of attorney was even signed. In July, Ethan tried a different tack, reaching out to me directly for the first time since the November dinner. manner, a long text message that alternated between apology and accusation, saying he was sorry for the pain this had caused but that I'd weaponized a private family struggle and that he hoped someday I'd understand what real forgiveness looked like. I didn't respond. Mr. Bennett advised me not to, given the active litigation, and honestly, I don't think I had anything left to say to him that wouldn't have made things worse for both of us. By August, nearly a year to the day after Grandma Vivien's death, Ethan agreed to a settlement rather than take the civil case to trial, on the advice of his own attorney, who apparently recognized that the casino paper trail, the neurologist's records, and Ruth's testimony left almost no room to maneuver in front of a jury. He agreed to repay $160,000, structured over 8 years, secured against future wages, and any assets he acquired, with a lien placed on anything he might inherit down the line. Kayla Voss settled separately for $22,000. Most of what she had left after the townhouse down payment was clawed back through the escrow process. The criminal case moved slower. Theft from an elderly or disabled adult carries real weight under Ohio law, and stretched on for another 5 months of continuances and negotiations I mostly experienced through terse updates from the prosecutor's victim advocate, a patient woman named Denise, who called me every few weeks whether or not there was real news, just so I wouldn't feel forgotten in a system built mostly around the defendant. In January, Ethan pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of theft from an elderly adult in the second degree, avoiding prison in exchange for 5 years of probation, mandatory restitution payments matching the civil settlement, 200 hours of community service, and a felony record that would follow him for the rest of his life. I gave a victim impact statement at the sentencing hearing, held in a Warren County courtroom with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that made everyone look faintly ill. My parents sat 2 rows behind Ethan, refusing to look at me as I walked to the podium. I had written the statement 3 times and thrown away the first 2 drafts because they read too much like anger and not enough like grief, and grief, I decided, was the truer thing. I told the judge about the recipe box. I told her about the 60-degree thermostat and the stale bread, and the teller who remembered Grandma sitting silent in a plastic chair. I said that my brother hadn't just taken money. He'd taken the last year of a woman's life and made it smaller and colder and more frightened than it needed to be, and that no restitution schedule would ever refund her that year. Ethan cried through most of it, his shoulders shaking, and I couldn't tell, and still can't tell, how much of it was remorse and how much was simply the sound of consequences finally arriving after 35 years of successfully outrunning them. The judge, before handing down the sentence, told him that the thing she found most troubling in the entire file wasn't the dollar amount. It was the 4-month gap between the dementia diagnosis and the power of attorney request. She said it showed intent, not opportunism. My father stood up like he wanted to object, and a bailiff took 1 step toward him, and he sat back down. I want to be honest that there was no moment of triumph in any of this. I didn't feel like I'd won. Mostly I felt tired and sad, in a way that settled into my body and stayed there for months. There was a specific afternoon, in September, going through the last box of Grandma Vivien's belongings that had been sitting in my parents' garage since the estate closed, when I found her recipe box, index cards in her looping cursive, a card for the pot roast she used to make every Sunday, a card for the sugar cookies she'd let me help decorate every December until I was probably 15 years too old for it. And I sat on the garage floor and cried for almost an hour, not about the money, about her, about the fact that the last year of her life had been quietly terrifying and confusing and cold, and none of us had caught it in time, and no lawsuit, no settlement, no felony conviction was ever going to give her that year back. My relationship with my parents has not recovered. Not really, though it's not entirely severed either. My mother and I speak maybe once a month now, careful conversations about nothing much, both of us avoiding the subject like it's a live wire. My father and I haven't spoken since that phone call in December, almost 2 years now. I know from Priya that they still see Ethan regularly, still help him when they can within the limits of his probation and his restitution schedule. Still, in some private corner of themselves, I suspect they'll never fully examine, believe that what happened to him was worse than what he did. The first Thanksgiving after the sentencing was the hardest. My mother sent an invitation through a group text, cheerful and determined, as if the last year could simply be legislated out of existence by enough mashed potatoes. I didn't go. Neither did Aunt Diane, or Uncle Gerald, or Priya, and the 5 of us ended up at my house instead, an odd, quiet, grateful little gathering around a table set for people who'd chosen each other rather than simply inherited one another. Uncle Gerald brought a bottle of wine and toasted, half joking, half not, to the family we actually picked. Aunt Diane cried a little during dessert, not about Ethan this time, but about Grandma, about how much she wished her own mother could have seen how many of us had shown up for each other in the end, even if it took losing her to make it happen. It wasn't the holiday any of us had pictured growing up. It was, in its own smaller and more honest way, a better one. I heard secondhand that my parents' Thanksgiving that year was just the 3 of them, my mother, my father, and Ethan, home on a supervised pass from his probation officer for the afternoon. Aunt Diane's daughter, who still spoke occasionally with a cousin on my father's side, said the table had been set for 8 anyway, out of habit or hope, and that my mother hadn't cleared the extra place settings until after the pie. I moved forward anyway. I still have my job, my husband Daniel, who sat through through every single deposition transcript with me and never once suggested I should let it go for the sake of family peace. I have Priya, who I talk to now more than I ever did growing up, who risked her career to hand me the truth when she could have just as easily looked away like everyone else did. I have Uncle Gerald and Aunt Diane, who chose evidence over comfort when it mattered. Daniel and I talked more than once during that year about what it would mean to raise our own kids someday inside a family with this history sitting behind it. We don't have children yet, but when we do, I already know the one rule I want to build our house around, the one my parents never managed in 35 years. The same consequence for the same mistake, no matter whose name is on it. I don't need our children to be perfect. I don't even need them to be particularly well behaved. I just need them to grow up believing that the floor under them is level, that nobody in the house is standing on a throne built out of somebody else's forgiveness. That's the whole inheritance I actually want to pass down. Not money, not a house, just a floor that doesn't tilt. I think about the golden throne a lot. That's how I've come to think of it privately. The invisible seat my parents spent 20 years building for Ethan, cushioned with excuses, gilded with second chances, while I sat on the floor beside it paying for every scraped mirror and every honest B+. I used to think the throne was the injustice. Now I think the throne was the trap. It's what taught Ethan that consequences were optional, that someone would always be there to explain away the wreckage, right up until the wreckage was too large for anyone to explain away at all. Nobody built that throne out of malice. My parents loved their son. That's what makes it worse, not better. That love, misapplied for 2 decades, was the exact mechanism that let a sweet, sick, cold, confused old woman freeze in her own house, while her favorite grandson gambled away everything she'd ever tried to leave behind for us. I don't know if Ethan will ever fully reckon with what he did. His probation officer's reports, which I'm entitled to see as a named victim in the case, describe someone compliant, punctual, outwardly cooperative, and utterly silent on the subject of remorse. Compliance isn't the same as understanding. I've made a kind of peace with the fact that I may never get the version of accountability I actually wanted from him, the one where he sits across from me and says plainly that he knew exactly what he was doing every single time he drove home from that casino and told our family Grandma was doing just fine. I'm not holding my breath for it anymore. I've stopped needing it to close the account in my own head. The paperwork closed it for me. The restitution checks arrive quarterly now, small and mechanical, processed through the court, and split 3 ways between me, Ethan himself as a beneficiary of what's left of the estate, and Priya. I don't spend the money. I put every check into a separate account I opened specifically for it. Money I think of as still belonging to Grandma Vivien more than to me, and someday, when it's grown enough, I plan to use it to endow something small and permanent in her name at the school library where she worked for 30 years, a reading room, maybe, or a fund for the kind of quiet, overlooked expenses that never make it into a budget request, the way she was quiet and overlooked and never made it into anyone's reel accounting until it was far too late. I visit her grave sometimes, out at Miami Valley Memorial, and I bring sugar cookies from a bakery near my house because I never did learn to make hers properly. I tell her I'm sorry it took me so long to bring the folder to that table. I tell her I wish I'd trusted my own instincts sooner, back when something first felt wrong and everyone told me to let it go. And I tell her every time that whatever it cost me, my father's silence, my mother's grief, the family holidays that will never look the same again, it was still less than what it cost her to sit alone in that cold house, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. Something real was lost in all of this. I don't pretend otherwise. A brother, a set of parents, a version of Sunday dinners I'll never get back, and a grandmother who deserved a warmer last year than the one she got. I carry all of that, and I don't expect it to get lighter. But I sleep at night now, knowing I finally asked it, and knowing that if I had it to do over again, folder in my shaking hands at that dinner table, I would still walk in and set those 2 pages down side by side.